listening to Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivana and Sam.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Transformation in Trials podcast. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Simon Taylor, who is Head of European Solution Consulting at Florence Healthcare. Florence Healthcare are a technology company involved in clinical research, specifically focused on site-based applications. Hi, Simon. Great to have you.
Thanks, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here.
Perfect. All right, Simon. So we're going to get to know all about you and what Florence Healthcare does during the course of this episode. But like with all of our episodes of Transformation in Trials, we try to center the conversation around a particular topic. And today's topic is, what does sponsor of choice really mean? And to get us started on this topic, I'm going to pose you this first question. And we have it just to kind of level set, Simon, we have a broad church in terms of our audience members for the Transformation in Trials podcast. So to get us started, perhaps you could describe to us, what are some of the challenges that clinical sites face in the year 2023?
That's a big question. There's a lot of them. It depends on where you are geographically, because some sites in some areas have more pressures on certain things than others. Typically, from what we see across all of our sites, so globally, there's a big staffing crisis at the moment. So there's sort of roughly, we see around 3% of the healthcare workforce turning over each month within sites. So all roles from, study nurses, CRAs, principal investigators, which has a really big impact on how research is done. Losing 3% of your workforce means losing 3% of efficiency and 3% of knowledge, which is an awful lot when it comes to a clinical study. Protocols are more complex than they've ever been before. They're becoming incredibly complex, particularly in areas like oncology, where you have adaptive trials and all these intelligent ways of doing it that put increased pressure on sites. Lots of other initiatives like diversity and inclusion, which I'm sure we'll speak about later, and other ways of meeting patients where they are and getting to patients rather than using just the traditional site model that's always been done. And sort of underpinning it all, fundamentally, there's a huge amount of paper still left in clinical research. And getting away from paper, whether it takes up physical space in binder rooms and on people's desks, or the fact that it slows down a lot of clinical research, is still one of the fundamental issues we see. I've been speaking to a lot of sites in the NHS in Europe this year, and one of their biggest challenges is that they've just got too much paper. And it is one of the things that really needs to shift in 2023 for us to really make an impact. Paper.
So people are still operating on paper-based systems in the year 2023. Wow.
An insane amount. There's so much of it. And with all the technology we have, it's still one of the fundamental ways that information is transcribed. Signatures are put down on paper, and all the challenges and the difficulties that you can imagine that come with that. When it comes to the end of actually trying to get a drug to market, fundamentally, a lot of notes are still written on paper before they're transcribed anywhere else, if they are transcribed anywhere else.
And aside from the fact of paper being inefficient, you tell me if it is efficient or inefficient, but what other challenges does that represent to maybe the different stakeholders involved in clinical trials operating in a paper-based ecosystem?
Well, it's not efficient, I can tell you that. So there's basic things like you lose an audit trail. If you have no paper, you have no audit trail of when things were added, who changed things, whether something's even acceptable to be put into a system later or further line. There's also really basic complexities, like a lot of medical information and a lot of patients' information is still on paper. So if someone prints it out, leaves it on the printer, you can have someone's medical information sitting there. And of course, no one's trying to do this. It's not deliberate. But in the world of GDPR and HIPAA and all the regulations surrounding people's private medical information, you can still have it lying around in a clinical research site. And it's something that I still think worries a lot of people, that all of that information is sitting there somewhere on someone's desk that in theory, anyone could read. And it's not something people think about, maybe outside of clinical research, but if you do stop and think about it, it probably does make you feel a little bit uneasy.
Yeah, it is. I was thinking while you were talking then, like when it comes to technology, there is so much focus on data privacy and protection of data, and the number of questionnaires and policies, procedures you need to adhere to sometimes just seems crazy. But then you paint a picture of a very unregulated medium like paper, which is still being used. So kind of questions why we have all of this kind of focus on the technology component when there's still paper in situ.
One of the interesting things about technology in general is one of the fundamental things we have within research at the moment is there's lots of complex technologies. All this DCT stuff that's been sort of coming out over the last couple of years, and some very complex technologies being given to sites. And sometimes the first place people need to go, if you're doing sort of a walk-run approach, is to get people digitized, get them using electronic systems day to day, get rid of the paper first before you get into the complex stuff and the really clever stuff. Deal with the fundamental issues. Like if you have a binder room full of paper, fundamentally, that's another room you could be used to convert to research or offices or whatever it might be within that site. And there's all those sorts of improvements that you get when you deal with the fundamentals. If you think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So imagine that in clinical research, the fundamental thing is getting off paper and digital. And until you have that foundation and that basis, the rest of it can't necessarily be realized until you've hit the basic layer. And I think a lot of the industry in the last couple of years that doesn't focus on sites like we do has probably forgotten that, and they've tried to get to the end point without really dealing with the current issues.
That's an interesting point. Good. Is some of it down to kind of user experience? Because if I put myself in any situation, actually, if I'm in a scenario where I don't want to use something, I'll default to what I'm always used to. Not that anyone can see this, but I'm writing notes on my notepad and pen, on a notepad with a pen. I'm in front of my desk and writing notes, notepad and pen. I've tried using electronic kind of ways of capturing notes during podcasts like this, but it just doesn't work for me from a user standpoint. So is that an element of what's happening here?
A little bit, yeah. And sometimes that comes down to you've been given technologies that you didn't actually want to use necessarily. And that is really the case with insights, that there's a lot of technologies being thrown at them that aren't actually what they need to do. If you think of a clinical research site, it's not that common for people to actually put data first into the EDC. I know people think that is what may happen, but it isn't necessarily what happens, because if a doctor, seeing 10 patients back to back, they may not have all the time to fill out the EDC or the nurse at that time, right? They may be putting it somewhere else before it goes in. And none of it's deliberate. People aren't trying to write this stuff on paper. They don't want to be inefficient. But just the way when you have staff that are overburdened and too much stuff going on at sites, you default to what you know best and what you do, which is typically you can write it all down and then transcribe it into a system later on. And once you have that gap, there's always a case where something could go wrong. And it's not all the time that it goes wrong, but if you leave that gap open, it will do at some point. And we do see that a lot. So it is down to user experience and user preference, but it's also down to you need to solve the challenges that they've got. If they don't have time to put it into a system, they're not going to do it, because sites focus at all times as patients. So whatever benefits the patient first. If you need to see another patient, you're not necessarily going to spend the time and fill out your EDC or put that information into a record and make the patient wait. There's focuses that they have that aren't always on technology. And sometimes the best technology just gives them the time back rather than making them do it.
Yeah, I would imagine in a resource constrained environment, like to one of your points when you first opened, it sounds like resourcing is a real challenge and people are losing resources at a rate that's becoming unsustainable.
They are, and technology can fix a lot of the resource issues, but people have to have the space and the scope and the time to be able to adopt them, change, and be able to use them properly before they can compound and to fix those challenges. So it's a little bit of a positive feedback loop, but those that actually take the time and are able to will see, and they do tend to see the benefits down the line at the end of the process.
Got it. So let's kind of switch gears a little bit, because we're talking a lot about the site here, but the site are only one part of or only one piece of the wider kind of ecosystem, the stakeholders involved. Perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about the dynamic that exists between sites and some of the other players involved, be it the sponsor, the CRO, and of course the patient, obviously too. What are some of the challenges and where are some of the friction there between those groupings?
You've had some of your guests on before that have spoken really eloquently about this. The things like relationships and contracts and the expectations between different parties is one of the biggest gaps. So what sponsors and CROs may expect of sites doesn't always translate into what actually happens. So whether it's things like contracts or payments or whatever it might be, doesn't always allude to what the site actually needs to do their job. And people always forget, I think it's easy to forget that the sites are the ones that actually deal with patients. You don't get your research, you don't get your results unless your site is interacting with a patient. Fundamentally, it just doesn't happen. So there just needs to be a bit of a balance shift and a better expectation and I don't know if equity is the right word, but a sense of them all being equal in terms of this is what we need and everyone being able to accommodate that, rather than it may be more pressure up the chain that comes down to make people do things or force things onto them, rather than having an open table discussion. And I've seen a few initiatives in the industry at the moment going on about this. I know Daniel spoke about this on your pod before. I agree with a lot of the things he said in terms of getting that equity and that understanding and the voice of every user at the further down the chain, including patients, including sites, as well as sponsors and CROs.
Yeah, I think that's something that would definitely be welcomed by all of those different stakeholders. What about DCT? Because I'm no expert on DCT, but at face value, you would think by the nature of that very concept, decentralizing, taking away from site, that sites are going to feel threatened by that. What's your view on this particular topic, Simon? What are you hearing from site stakeholders that perhaps you've had conversations with on this particular topic?
The most common thing that we've heard from sites, in particular in the last couple of years, is that DCTs, they're not resistant to DCTs. It's not that they don't want to run them. It's that they've been thrown an operating model and technologies at them that they're not equipped to deal with. So if someone, if a site's running around with too much paper and too many binders, they don't want to be thrown a load of wearable headsets, so they don't have time to learn to actually interact with a patient. And it's that gap in between that's the biggest issue. It's not that sites don't want to do it. DCT is a great way of being able to get to patients and physically meet them where they are, but they have to be able to adopt it in a way that helps them as well. Because if they're not able to adopt it and they get all these pressures, they get thrown technologies, they're not able to use them effectively. And of course, if they're not doing it right, they have issues, they have whatever at the site. It seems like it's the site's fault because they've not been able to use the technology or this process properly. But sometimes it's because they've been at the end of the chain and they've been thrown technology that they weren't necessarily ready for or equipped for or really resourced adequately to be able to use. DCT is a very big topic in this respect. And some people do it very well and others maybe see it as just this big leap to giant technology, which they may have jumped too far before coming back to where they need to be.
Yeah, I think that the resounding theme that we get from our guests, including yourself, is like you can't just throw technology at any of these problems and expect it to stand up and sort out the problem on its own. It's always a combination of the holy triangle or whatever you want to call it: people, process, technology, and culture thrown in as well.
I always give the example that I have a relative that will only do bank transfers, only knows how to do bank transfers by going into branch and doing it with the bank teller. It's a very old-fashioned way of doing it, but it's sort of the traditional way that people have done it for years. You can't give her an iPad and expect her to do a bank transfer without telling her what to do or helping her, even asking if that's what she wants to do. And it's an over-exaggerated example, but it's the exact same thing that we're seeing, which is there's one way of sort of we've always done it. There's not an understanding of technology. And then it's just like, hey, here's an iPad, you do this now. And that's the reason why these sorts of initiatives, or some of them, haven't worked as well as all of the sort of the marketing and media hype made them out to be.
Yeah, I've just come back from a conference actually, and even being in this industry, involved in technology, then just the sheer volume of vendors servicing like data collection, for example, is just astronomical. And if you think about, like, well, if I put myself in someone from a site's perspective and they had to handle and get their heads around all of that technology, it just I can see where they're coming from with respect to that. Do you think they feel threatened at all, sites, about the potential kind of swing in the pendulum away from a business model where site is really kind of the center of the universe here in terms of the conduct of the trial? And, like, let's be honest, like, money talks, and with that, is there an element of conflict perhaps?
It's a question that always comes up, and I've not spoken to a site that said that they feel threatened by this or they feel that it's going to replace them in any way, shape, or form. Because don't forget, the sites are where patients are, right? Mm-hmm. So regardless of what happens, the site fundamentally have the relationship with patients in the current world, and sometimes it's just around enabling the sites to be with patients more, going to their homes or sending them technology that they're able to use in their homes. But there's also models of DCT where, you know, people are using things like frontier sites or sites that are new to research, being those that may have never run clinical research before, or they've taken up spaces in local areas where there are lots of patients where they're able to go and meet them. If you think of the COVID testing and COVID vaccines we had in the UK, for example, you know, I'm in Cambridge, all the park and ride sites around here were taken for testing and for vaccination, right? That is a model where you get away from the traditional site, but that's still being run by Adam Rooks in the hospital. That is a DCT. That's being out in the community, meeting patients, getting away from the centralized hospital specifically. But it's not the site. The site aren't being replaced. They're being given all the resources they need. They're just doing it in a different way. So as long as sites are able and think that way, that they're not being replaced, it's just a chance to evolve and be better at this and do better research and more research, then I think everyone will be fine.
Got it. But what they don't want, to your earlier point, is just be throwing a bunch of technology to make a already complex situation even more complicated.
Yeah, I've got 5 EDCs. Got 5 EDCs. Don't give me 10. Or don't now give me like Minority Report style screens that when, you know, I can't turn on my computer. Like there's a level of understanding that needs to happen and an adoption curve with technology that is sometimes ignored.
Understood. So what's your view on diversity in clinical trials, and do you have a perspective on what's being talked about from the site's standpoint when it comes to diversity? Diversity is an interesting one because it has regulatory backing from the industry, from the agencies. So they've actually, you know, the FDA have come out and said, this isn't something we'd like you to do. You're doing this. And that's where it's different from DCT in terms of it's going to happen. It will happen. And we've already seen, you know, my LinkedIn at the moment is full of big pharma talking about their diversity and inclusion initiatives, not just in senior leadership, but also in how they run their research. And there is a very deliberate shift towards it. So it is a good thing if you see the stats of representation in research. The numbers that are skewed are really bad. So there really is a reason to do this and do it properly. So whilst it does seem like the big marketing thing, and it seems like, you know, is diversity the new DCT type thing for 2023, there's a reason for it. And the fact that the FDA have come out and mandated it and the EMA are rumored to be doing similar means that it is going to happen and people will be doing this. But it also needs a change in model. It needs sites to be able to go to places where you have underrepresented communities and try and figure out how you get them into research. And that in itself is a challenge, and they need to be able to do that. But the good thing is that because it's been mandated, because it's coming, it is happening. It's not an if, it's a when. They will be resourced to do that, and it will become a fundamental part of those trials that we'll see in the research in, you know, sort of 10 years time, when you have all these drugs that are being researched now with expanded diversity having an impact. We'll be able to see the impact it made because, you know, they've come out and said, you're doing this. Yeah, I totally agree. It's 100% needed. So you've painted quite a very strong picture of the challenges that sites face, Simon, in terms of resourcing, changes in how studies are designed and protocol design, etc., adaptive trials, We just talked about diversity and inclusion, and we started the conversation talking about the over-reliance on paper. When there are challenges, there's normally opportunity for technology solutions, amongst others. Perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about what options there are out there for sites that are going to help kind of help sites get to grips with some of these issues and challenges.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm at Florence Healthcare, right? So we're a technology company that's specifically for sites, and thank you for bringing this up, Sam. So we enable sites. The idea is to give sites time back in their day by giving them the systems that they need, and those systems allow them to use their workflows, get off paper, run things like e-consent, participate in a sponsored eTMF, have an investigator site file or regulatory binders digitized and off paper that they're able to use within their sites, and have those connected into either sponsor systems or the larger sites, which might have multi-system environments similar to a sponsor. They're able to do that as well. So those are sort of the fundamental. And of course, we're not the only company out there doing things that benefit sites. We would say, of course, that we're the best, and we came from the site side. That's all we've ever done. We're not sponsor focused that suddenly do sites. We are a site focused organization, and we think we do it very well. But there are a lot of technologies out there now. It's just about getting to the sites and helping them adopt the technology to enable them to run after they've walked.
Just go a little bit deeper, if you don't mind, Simon, on the specific kind of technologies that you offer sites. Are you talking about like EDC and data acquisition technologies, or is it more kind of workflow related technologies, or a bit of both and more?
So we're not a data collection platform. We more exist in the space of getting all of the paper away from sites. So when you have like an investigator site file, so tracking all the documents that a site needs to be able to run a study compliantly, which either the sponsor requires to go into an eTMF on the other side, or just that they have on paper lying around. So the typical things like, CVs, 1572s, financial disclosure forms, all that sort of stuff we digitize, as well as the regulatory documentation that sites need to do their work day to day, and again, to be compliant. We also want to go a little bit further and just allow sites to have whatever documentation they need. So if they have SOPs or trainings that they've done or anything else that they just want to get off paper and put in a system, we want to provide that to them as well. So we do all of that sort of thing. We can connect into things like eSource and electronic medical records so that we can enable things like remote monitoring. So if someone wants to connect to a sponsor, and have their sponsors do remote monitoring to save on all those costs, they're able to do that as well. But just fundamentally removing the amount of paper that they have and giving them the documentation and workflow platforms with things like e-signatures and workflow and, QC, all those kind of, the basics that we have within document management that make a real difference when they're done right. That's what we want to give to sites and to give them the ability to do that. We call it site enablement. It is a term I see out there a lot, and we use it day to day. It's about giving the sites the technology they need so they can use it appropriately and use it properly.
Understood. And is this the sort of technology that sites would make a decision to invest in themselves as a site, as a standalone business, or is it something that sponsors would make the investment to provide for their sites to be, well, I guess back to this topic of being the site of choice or the sponsor of choice for a site?
It's a good question. And the answer is both. It depends on how able the site is to adopt the technology in the first place. So if they have the ability to do that, the budgets, and be able to take on the change management, sponsors are also able to do that as well. So a sponsor can provide technology for them to do that. And as you said, one of the key tenets of being a sponsor of choice is enabling sites to do their best work. And because you're the one that enabled that, you're the sponsor that the site wants to use and wants to compete for their studies. So it's for everybody, but depending on who you are and what you do and who wants to be involved in different places, we're able to offer both.
We didn't even touch upon the competitive nature of site selection for sponsors, right? Again, I'm no expert on this topic, but anecdotally, I hear that it can be quite competitive to get certain sites to work with you if you're competing with multiple sponsors at any given time. Is that right?
Very much so. And resource crunches are one of the biggest reasons why there is so much competition, because sometimes it's the overabundance of studies because there's a lot of research being run. And sometimes it's because you're not as a site necessarily equipped to run all those studies at once. So you have to pick and you have to choose. And the sponsors that are able to give them technology that expand their resources, that make their day-to-day better, so they're not just worrying about paper, are the ones that will get chosen more and more, because they've actually allowed the site to be the best business they can be, as well as a research site. And that really is what sponsor of choice is. It's about enabling them to do that. So the sites want to use you if there is competition.
And if a site makes an investment in this technology, is this something that they can use with multiple sponsors, or do they have to have different implementations of this particular product from Florence to be able to work with multiple sponsors?
They can use multiple within it. I won't go into all the technical details necessarily, but through things like security and roles and permissions, it's easy to have a multi-sponsor environment where you're running multiple studies in a segregated way for each sponsor that allows everything you would expect when it comes to compliance and privacy for each sponsor, and the confidentiality that comes alongside that.
Awesome. And can you share with us perhaps any feedback you've received from sites, both kind of objective and subjective, in terms of outcomes that they've experienced off the back of shifting to a more kind of digitalized approach like you've just described?
There's anecdotal stuff. So people being very happy about using us, giving them time back in their day. People are able to finish at 4 or 5 o'clock on a Friday when they're supposed to be, which is always one of the biggest ones. We have hard metrics like, the G2 surveys that get run. 92% of sites favored us for our technology. We came out on top of that, partly because we're a site-facing technology. We know what sites need. But anecdotally, we have a lot of happy sites that want to use us for lots and lots of different reasons. Some of it is enabling them to do the best research day to day. But, as you know, Sam, in making end users happy is about a multitude of things. And it's not just always about giving patients, the highest standard of care. It's about not getting in the way of giving patients the right standard of care, and being able to do that and give them that time back because they're not spending that much time in the technology is one of the best things we can do as technology providers to get out of the way. So take all the stuff that gets out of the way of providing world-class care. And that's where our sites are happiest, because they know what they're doing. It's easy to use. They can do it quickly. They can do it compliantly, and they know it's all done. And then they can get back to doing it, to being with their patients and not being completely overworked and burnt out.
Sounds pretty cool. Anything else you want to share on the technology, Simon, before we move on to the next topic?
No, I'll get off my soapbox. I think we can move on.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think everything in the pharma landscape seems to be moving at a million miles an hour at the moment. So my next question is around predictions for the future. Where do you see the site landscape heading in the next few years? And you can take that in whatever direction you want.
I honestly think, and not just because, it is the reason why I work in as well, but I honestly think we're going to have enormous adoption rates of site-facing technology from all sides. So I think sites hopefully will be seeing the results of this, particularly when you look geographically. You have US sites are pretty well adopted to technology. They sort of adopted it first. It's shifting over to Europe now. So I think we're going to have a big shift of that, but also a big shift in sponsors being able to provide this technology. And CROs being able to provide this technology for their sites. So I do think we're going to see a big shift in this becoming standard and paper fundamentally not becoming commonplace. And hopefully in a few years, it will be the outlier that uses paper rather than the norm sometimes. And even though that sounds like a very strange metric or a very strange sort of measure of success, I think that is what we'll get to. And that will be a real success metric, to be able to say that it is the outlier that's using paper rather, than someone at the forefront across all places. We in the UK, we have the NHS, the wonderful NHS, but they are particularly overburdened and haven't always been able to focus on technologies. And I think we'll see that shift as well as we move. So it's going to be an interesting couple of years.
What are the biggest barriers to people adopting this type of technology? Because from my standpoint, it makes total sense. If you've got all of these benefits, you're going to get rid of paper, you can have audit trail, etc. You're going to make life easier. Why wouldn't the pace of adoption be even quicker than what it is today?
It's the same reason that technologies exist in our industry and have done for years. Change management is one of the hardest things, and helping understand the change itself So things like the resistance to cloud is a very, very commonplace, particularly in Europe. So understanding what the cloud is, what the benefits are of it, and actually helping people realize that it's the best thing for them. And there's always resistance around those sorts of things. I've always done it this way, so why can't I keep doing it this way? And being able to take someone out of that place and giving them something better is a really hard conversation to have. I know you know this very well. So being able to prove the benefits of something in someone's day-to-day life, not just from a financial return on investment point of view, but helping end users understand the benefits they can make from it. That's still the biggest challenge, is helping them understand whatever concerns they have, whether it is resistance to technology, whether it is the cloud, whether it's just resistance to change. Helping overcome those, that's what I see anyway, is still the biggest burden towards everybody adopting technology.
I like that answer, Simon. Thanks for providing that extra level of detail there. And as we get towards the end of the podcast, we always ask the same final question. And that question is, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the industry, what would that be?
It would be equity in the conversation across sponsor, CRO, site, and patient. So everybody at an equal footing around the table when we design protocols, when we have negotiations about contracts, when we're sitting down and planning what the life cycle of a drug is going to be, or what that research life cycle is, that everyone has an equal footing in the conversation. Because once that happens, then we will see the highest quality of research.
And I think many of our listeners will resonate and agree with that final response from you, Simon. Listen, I hope so. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I know our listeners will do too. If they want to find out more about either yourself or Florence Healthcare, where's the best place for them to reach out?
The website for Florence is always the best place. There's lots of resources on there, not just about us and our technology, but about the industry itself. Or my LinkedIn, so find me on LinkedIn, Simon Taylor, and send me a message, send me anything, and I'm always happy to chat.
Awesome, Simon. And I can see possible future episodes that maybe incorporate a slightly roundtable approach where we might get technology, site, sponsor, and even patient perspective to talk about some of the topics that we've discussed today, and also topics we've had other guests discuss on previous episodes. So we'd be very keen to be back for those types of discussions if you're interested.
I'd love to. I think one of the things, people often hear these conversations and they assume that everything that's going wrong or that isn't necessarily working properly is deliberate. And sometimes it's just because this is my focus in my day-to-day. And when you don't have every perspective that's out there, the conversation gets skewed to whatever your line of vision is. And if we were to, people would understand everybody's picture rather than just one.
Absolutely. Thanks, Simon. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivana Rosendahl on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.